Section 1. Introduction. The enduring question of power versus freedom. Power versus freedom. This simple yet profound dichotomy lies at the very heart of the American Civil War. Was the conflict a noble struggle to preserve the Union, or a desperate fight to protect the long-held rights of individual states and the personal freedoms of their citizens? We will walk through the critical years leading up to the war, 1850s through 1861. We'll illuminate the key events, the competing ideas, and the powerful personalities. This is the story of how a clash over government power ignited a war. Mid-19th century America, stark contrasts, rapid expansion, new territories being settled and organized into states. North, a vibrant industrial economy, factories and cities expanding, a society increasingly reliant on wage labor and commerce. South, a different world, agriculture and plantations, vast farms and pastoral life, an economy deeply intertwined with slavery. Slavery is the bedrock of Southern culture, law, and social order. Southern leaders grew anxious as Washington grew in size and scope. They feared a strong centralized government threatened their way of life. They argued a distant federal authority couldn't understand local needs. To counter this, they championed states' rights. The constitutional theory, the Union as a voluntary compact of sovereign states. States must retain authority over internal affairs, free from federal interference. This, they claimed, safeguarded local liberty. The debate had tangible consequences for daily life. Federal power versus state autonomy became a political flashpoint. As the nation expanded westward, would territories permit slavery or be designated free soil? Each new state risked tipping the balance in Congress. Southerners feared a federal government dominated by Northern anti-slavery interests would abolish slavery nationwide. Their argument for states' rights was a defensive wall against encroaching federal power. The Southern argument for states' rights was rooted in the nation's founding principles. Leaders like John C. Calhoun of South Carolina argued passionately that the Constitution was not the creation of a single national people but a compact agreed upon by sovereign states. States had delegated only specific limited powers to the federal government. All other powers were reserved to the states themselves or to the people. The economic grievances of the South were not imaginary. They were a source of profound anger that festered for decades, long before the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter. A prime example of this was the Tariff of 1828, a piece of legislation so despised in the South that it earned the name the Tariff of Abominations. A tariff is, quite simply, a tax imposed on imported goods. The industrializing North strongly supported high tariffs. These taxes made foreign manufactured goods more expensive, protecting northern industries from British and European competition. For the South, however, the tariff was an economic poison. The Southern economy was overwhelmingly agricultural and deeply connected to international trade, cotton, tobacco, to markets in Europe, particularly Great Britain. In return, they imported many finished goods, farming equipment, clothing, household items. The high tariff meant that Southerners had to pay more for these imported necessities. At the same time, the tariff made it harder for European partners to sell in the US, risking retaliatory tariffs on Southern cotton abroad. Southern leaders argued the federal government used its taxing power to enrich one section at the expense of another, government acting as agent for special interests, picking winners and losers. John C. Calhoun developed his theory of nullification in response. He argued a state could declare a federal law null and void. South Carolina even threatened secession in the 1830s. Though the crisis was averted, the memory lingered, proof that economic conflict could push the nation to the brink, inseparable from the debate over federal power and citizens' well-being. It is impossible to discuss the causes of the Civil War without acknowledging the central, agonizing role of slavery. The institution was a profound moral stain on the nation and a source of irreconcilable conflict. For many in the North, opposition grew from a belief in human liberty and the Declaration of Independence. Abolitionists saw it as a brutal sin that must be eradicated. Yet Southern leaders often framed their reasons not as defense of bondage, but as defense of their right to self-government. They argued the federal government had no constitutional authority to interfere with states' domestic institutions. This strategic framing was crucial. By casting the debate as state control versus federal control, Southern politicians sought to broaden their appeal to slaveholders and others wary of strong central government. If the federal government could abolish slavery, what was to stop it from dictating other aspects of local life? What other forms of private property might be threatened next? The fight over expansion became the primary battleground. Missouri Compromise, Kansas-Nebraska Act, Dred Scott decision. For the South, taking enslaved property into new territories tested their equality in the Union. For the North, restricting spread was a moral imperative and defense of free labor, not slave labor. Even as slavery remained the root cause, political language revolved around power. When Southern states seceded, their declarations focused on perceived federal hostility to their rights, citing Lincoln's election as proof they couldn't protect their interests, claiming the compact broken and withdrawal their recourse. The election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1860 was the spark that lit the fuse of secession. Lincoln was the candidate of the Republican Party, founded on preventing expansion of slavery west. While he stated he had no intention to interfere where slavery existed, the South saw catastrophe. For decades, Southern leaders relied on a delicate balance in Washington. With Lincoln's election, they believed that balance was shattered. They faced a federal government led by a man whose party was, in their view, hostile to their way of life. They saw him as figurehead of radical abolitionism bent on their economic and social ruin. Denying the right to take slave property into territories was seen as a direct assault on constitutional rights and a precursor to total emancipation. Between election and inauguration, the crisis escalated. South Carolina seceded in December 1860. 6 Deep South states quickly followed. They did not wait for Lincoln to act. His election alone was deemed sufficient. Secession was a preemptive act of self-preservation to protect autonomy. Lincoln pleaded for union, promised not to interfere with slavery where it existed, and insisted government would not initiate conflict, yet declared the union perpetual and indissoluble. He stated his duty to hold, occupy, and possess federal property. For seceded states seizing forts and arsenals, this signaled intent and confirmed their fears of coercion. They saw not an offer of peace, but a threat to use federal power to compel their return. President Abraham Lincoln faced an unprecedented crisis. He believed his paramount duty was to preserve the Union, one single indivisible nation. He rejected the Southern right to secede. Secession was, in his view, illegal rebellion, and as president, he had an obligation to suppress it. Lincoln began to wield federal power in ways never before imagined. War demanded centralization and authority, altering Washington's relationship with the states. He argued preservation justified extraordinary measures. One of the most controversial, suspending the writ of habeas corpus, an Anglo-American safeguard against unlawful imprisonment. He unilaterally suspended the right in strategic areas, enabling military arrests of suspected Confederate sympathizers without trial, a dramatic expansion of executive power. Critics, even in the North, called it tyranny. Lincoln argued it was necessary to maintain order and cripple the Confederate effort from within. Federal power expanded into the economy. First, income tax, a national currency, the greenbacks, a national banking system, organized bond markets, centralizing the financial framework. These moves showed the government's ability to mobilize national resources, a clear philosophical shift from the limited federal role before. For Southerners, the war fought tyrannical central power. For Lincoln and the Union, a strong central government guaranteed liberty and survival. That tension really reshaped how the country would be governed. Perhaps no single act brought federal power into ordinary lives more directly than the military draft. In 1863, the Union passed the first federal conscription act in American history. For the first time, the national government asserted authority to compel army service. Prior to this, the military had been volunteers, state militias. The draft was a radical assertion of federal power over the individual, subordinating personal liberty to the needs of the nation-state. The war required mobilization of resources and of human lives under the direction of Washington. Implementation met fierce resistance, most famously the deadly New York City draft riots of July 1863. Many, especially poor immigrants, saw the draft as intolerable. One could hire a substitute or pay $300, prompting the charge: a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Opposition to intrusive power surged. Beyond the draft, Washington took control of telegraph lines and strategic railroads. New agencies managed supplies, food, weapons, uniforms. New taxes affected commerce nationwide. Justified by emergency, these measures set precedent for federal intervention in economy and society, building a more active administrative state. Ironically, the Confederacy also imposed drafts, taxes, and controls, creating friction with state governors, learning that modern war required national mobilization that clashed with limited government. At its core, the Civil War was a violent collision between two fundamentally different visions of freedom and the future of American power. Confederate leaders defined freedom by local autonomy and the absence of federal interference, liberty thriving when power stayed close to the people. Their fight was to preserve a decentralized republic, a confederation of sovereign states, where domestic institutions, including slavery, were secure from outside meddling. They saw themselves as heirs of 1776, fighting for the right to govern themselves. For Lincoln and Union supporters, freedom meant a single, unified nation under a law applying equally to all. The liberty of the Declaration required a federal government strong enough to protect it. The freedom of a state to secede was, to them, the freedom to destroy the nation. The Union was not a mere compact. It was a permanent and sacred bond. This freedom required a government able to enforce its laws and defend its existence. The war itself became the ultimate argument. A loose confederation struggled to manage large-scale conflict, plagued by divisions, hoarding of resources, and resistance to central authority. The Union leveraged industry and population through an increasingly efficient federal government. Victory proved the case for a strong national government in crisis. The constitutional order was reshaped toward national supremacy. The American Civil War was a crucible of fire and blood that forged a new nation. While slavery was its undeniable and profound cause, the conflict was fought and justified through the language of power and freedom. Southern leaders championed states' rights and local liberty, warning of federal threats to their constitutional freedoms. Lincoln and the North used immense federal power to preserve one indivisible nation. The Union's victory established the supremacy of a federal law, creating a more centralized republic than the founders envisioned. The consequences were immense. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments abolished slavery and empowered the federal government to protect citizens' rights from state infringement. For the first time, the Constitution explicitly empowered federal intervention for liberties. The balance swung decisively to Washington, cemented by more than 600,000 lives. Before the war, Americans asked, "Are we a nation?" After the war, the language itself changed, a subtle sign of a transformed national identity. Yet the fundamental question, proper balance between federal power and state autonomy, was not permanently resolved. It remains central today. Healthcare, education, economic regulation, environmental policy, states' rights, challenging mandates, federal action addressing cross-border problems. The echoes of the 1860s endure in our discourse. The tension between local control and national unity is a constant. Debates over constitutional structure are never merely academic. They carry profound real-world consequences. When many believe the central government is no longer legitimate, the nation's fabric frays. The Civil War warns of the costs of imbalance. Power versus freedom is no simple question. It is live, and finding a sustainable balance is the perpetual, essential task of the American experiment.